let's kind of start with us. Abby, what do you think is next for open source software?
I'm mic'd up. What do I think is next? It's such a big question. So I think the thing is open source software just follows the needs of the industry. Like open source is always going to be doing the same things that other businesses end up kind of building. So I think what's next is right now we're trying to figure out how to enable people at higher levels of abstractions. We're continuing to move up the stack. So I think we're going to keep seeing that happening more. And I think that there is a big movement over the last couple of years of what does it look like to have sustainable open source for maintainers and for the people behind the open source. So what does it look like to have licenses that enable companies to sustain themselves, and what does it look like to have payment models from people who use open source software? So I think that's going to be the big challenges.
Nic V.
Yeah, Mike. So for me, first thing, I think we did a good job at kind of inviting non-technical people to start contributing. When I was younger, a long time ago, documentation was very, very difficult to read in any sort of project. It probably started with man pages, which was more like an art to understand, when you're, 19, 20, and the only source, because in my days, internet was not necessarily there. So source was man pages. Not the best thing written by developers for developers, not necessarily very user-focused. But over time, with the community opening up, I think first the behavior, generally speaking, of the community of the developers, greatly improved over time, welcoming people from various, of course, diverse background. Non-technical for me is really a good thing, because if they get the passion, maybe they're going to be becoming technical at some point. So we did a good job with this. But I think at the same time, we still need to improve this. And it also comes to governance. And I think what is next for the open source community is the adoption of a distributed autonomous organization scheme. I would love to see that using basically blockchains to have decentralized governance, have a way to reward contributors, incite people to contribute, to participate. Also a way to get fundings from company. Maybe this one is a bit more controversial. But being able to be decentralized for the governance, the content, feature prioritization, I think this is really what I like to see. And second, in terms of licensing, I've spent so much time on reading licenses and stuff like that. I still can't figure out things like what can I use, what are the impacts. If my project is using this particular project, what are going to be the consequences, what are the risks? Then you will have probably to pay a lot of money to lawyers and just to figure it out. I think that's enough time.
Go for it, Nic.
I think I'm ever the optimist, so I think the future's bright. There are clearly a lot of problems, and I think the first step in tackling any problem is to recognise that there is a problem. So the recurring themes around sustainability, accessibility, inclusivity, AI, how much of that is hype and how much of that is hype in terms of how that might improve society, as well as destroying jobs, kind of cutting through that and understanding what the practical and pragmatic reality is. We've kind of heard a lot about that over the last couple of days, and a lot of that, gives me cause to remain optimistic and to believe that the future of open source software is bright. Exactly what Abby was saying as well, building the right levels of abstractions. It feels like we've gone on this long journey to leverage the best of infrastructure to build the right layers of abstraction that deliver that business value. I feel like I'm just rambling at this point.
I think we've seen such a breadth of topics in this track, and it just goes to show open source is everywhere, whether it's in the firmware, there are other tracks talking about hardware as well, all the way up to application layer and platform layers. I do think, sort of building a little bit on what Nic said, we talk a bit about like social contracts as well as licenses, and I think maybe the open source community will start to formalise that thinking a bit more. I can see that being something we talk about and develop kind of more standards, much like we start to see governance standards coming out and recommendations and templates. I know there are folks in the CNCF, and I'm sure in other groups, doing really great work, kind of saying this is a model. You don't have to use this model, but it's an interesting model for governing and
Smart contract.
Smart contracts. Yeah. Okay. Do we have questions from the audience for any of the folks up here? I will run down. We'll meet in the middle.
Hi, it's a question that's kind of personal and urgently relevant to me. Do you see any kind of reason to be optimistic about the sustainability of open source? Abby, you mentioned it as a topic. Nic, you also kind of mentioned some things around that. And in particular around funding open source that doesn't have a big corporate sponsor.
I agree with that, and sometimes being part of what I see in the company I've worked for, I'm not a big fan of open source projects as a posture. Heavily sponsored by a single big company. It can influence prioritization, all these kind of things. And again, for me, distributed autonomous organization with a system of token blockchain for funding, for decision, for everything, is the most transparent solution. So for me, that would be the answer. If we don't have that, there is always be some sort of obfuscation, regardless of how open you want to be, right? It needs to be implemented in a way that is completely open from the beginning, right? Because human beings are biased by design, right? If we rely on something like blockchain with smart contracts, where you could define the condition to participate in the project, the condition of actually codify all those policies, like all the CNCF guidelines, policy, or from other, Apache Foundation, all that. If we have a way to codify this and automatically apply this, then I think probably there will be other issues, right, for sure. But I think it can solve a lot of the problems we currently have, and probably we'll have others as well.
I'm not sure I think technology is, I think we need technology to do auto-validation of stuff for sure, just to keep ourselves honest and aware. Sometimes it's just awareness about things and not an intention to subvert the intention of open source. But I'm not sure it's all technology, because bias gets built into things all the time. If anyone's ever been in a agile retro where they're say things that you're happy and sad and whatever about, you can word the stickies to fit in a column that you want, right? You can just always bias things in that way. So one thing you mentioned that I think is an interesting balance is that idea of, is a single, and in your question you asked, is a single corporate sponsor a problem? And I think that is, or the other way around, not to have that, yeah. I was going to say, and I think that was something that you were, maybe I misheard, but I think you were saying that's not great. We want to be able to decentralize it more. But if you look at the CNCF projects, one of the hats I wear is a working group lead in the CNCF working group platforms. And it's really hard, and you look at these projects, the ones that are able to sustain and go are the ones that do have a strong backing. There is concern over where the project goes, but at the end of the day, product roadmaps have to evolve. Someone has to make a decision. The amount of kind of log blocks we get in working groups where you don't have someone who can just say, look, this is the direction that we're going, can also be a detriment to a project. Because then all of a sudden you can't progress because you're too worried about getting everyone on the same page, and it's, a problem there. So Yeah, I think it's about transparency. I think that point you made is really the clutch, is if you can have transparent awareness of where things are going and how money is being made off of it so that you can make decisions about if you want to use it, then, yeah, I don't know. So it was a bit of a waffle, but.
I think because, people love a controversy on a panel, so I am going to disagree. Not with you, Abby. I think I'm agreeing with you, but I'm going to disagree with you because I'm not sure that I don't think the problem that we have with folks working on open source projects, I don't really think mechanising it or tracking it with blockchain or whatever technology is the problem. I think the problems are much more to do with communication and aligning expectations and aligning kind of incentives. And I'm not sure that I don't think blockchain either adds or takes away from how you could align incentives. It's much more about, well, who's going to work on the thing? Why do they care about that outcome? How are they getting food on the table? Where's their paycheck coming from? And whether that's like from a single corporate sponsor or from a group of people or group of organisations, they've got to have like a shared destination they're trying to get to. Otherwise, yeah, you just end up having like the lowest common denominator. So I'm going to, that's mine.
Oh, that's perfectly.
I'm just going to sit on the fence. Although, slightly agree with Nick as well, because those Nicks have got to stick together clearly. It's very obviously a people problem, and the tendency as engineers is to try and find technology that solves the people problem or allows us to build an abstraction that kind of works around it. But I can see how it can be complementary in a way that there's a degree of transparency, and it provides context to how decisions were made, why they were made, how they can be enforced, that kind of stuff. So they can provide us those useful guardrails that might help to influence otherwise unwanted, external influence.
I'd be curious what you mean by that. So there's sort of, what would be unwanted external influence? I can understand like security risks, if a bad actor comes in and inserts something bad in there, but in the sense of like product or project direction, I feel like that's in the eye of the beholder, and that's why we thankfully have a diversity of open source projects. You can use Flux CD, you can use Argo CD. They have very different implementations, but they both are built under the same principles, and you can choose. But so what would be just an example, just so I can understand more?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what you said. I'm just going to sort of restate and rephrase what you've already said in some ways, which is that oftentimes it's about who is working on a project that gets to define and dictate the direction of that project. And quite often it is some corporate entity that has the pockets and the backing and the customers behind them to put people on those projects, to define that roadmap. But it might not always be in the best interest of the community, if you see what I'm saying. We do see this across open source, and it happens an awful lot in the ecosystem. And it's just part and parcel of the industry that we've built, I suppose, in a certain way.
And so an example might be where almost hamstringing the open source project in preference of something that's being paid for and built on top of it. Yeah.
And there's reasons, good and bad, I suppose. People have got to get paid, and it's what came up during some of the conversations yesterday. Ultimately, people have got to work, like most people have got to earn a living, and they've got to work on something, and we have to find a way to make sure developers get paid for the right reasons. It's not always a passion project. Some people want to just turn up and write code. They don't really care. They just want to do the thing. But yeah, I think some open source projects obviously grow to a certain size and shape that they are so influential and so important, Linux kernel being one, that we have to be careful around how it's influenced and how it's governed. We're very lucky that we have, some might not say lucky, that we have someone like Linus Torvalds. Okay, he might not have the right temperament all the time, and maybe the way in which he communicates his intent isn't always the most democratic. But obviously that's one example where it has worked out well, but there are, I'm sure there are other projects where that might not be the case.
Makes sense.
I often think we don't look at the Linux kernel project enough as a model for a long-term, really highly successful. I mean, there is no more successful open source project, I don't think. And one of the things that they do, I think, very deliberately is, you have to earn trust and confidence if you're going to contribute to that project. And nobody can come by and sort of scattergun, like, well, in my opinion, we should rebuild, blah, 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 in a whatever different way, people would just laugh them out of town if they didn't have a track record of already working in that area and have the confidence of essentially a sort of consensus opinion. And they really do seem to work a lot through consensus. And quite often I see projects kind of going, yeah, but this should be more like a democracy and everybody should have a voice. I'm like, do you really deserve a voice, or do you need to have earned the right to have that choice? I think that's something we don't really talk about very consciously a lot.
The governance model for the kernel, though. I mean, I think that's an interesting point, but the governance model for the kernel is different from something like this, the CNCF projects, in that the Linux Foundation employs Linus Torvalds, I think Greg Grover Hartman as well, and several other people are actually paid by the Linux Foundation full-time just to do that. I wonder whether that, is different from a governance perspective.
I have opinions, if anybody wants to understand. I don't think it is. I don't think it's really any different from being paid a salary by, anybody. I mean, the reason why the Linux Foundation exists is really that kind of, who does get to pay Linus Torvalds, and I guess a kind of prisoner's dilemma situation that the world has been put in there. But I don't think that actually affects the way it's governed. I think whoever was writing his paycheck, it would be a kind of benevolent dictatorship of sorts.
It's probably, this might be problematic, it's probably as an impartial a way as any of ensuring an impartial outcome, if that makes any sense. Although the Linux Foundation is obviously backed by various corporate interests, we're all sort of trusting them to, be as impartial as possible and just leave Linus and the community of people that work on the kernel alone to do the right thing.
Yeah, agreed. More questions? Or observations or points? Yes?
Going back to the sort of the role of the committer and actually putting, obviously putting bread on the table and actually spinning out of a life and things like that. I just was recently thinking, is it time that actually when we're talking to corporations, you start talking about the way that rather than using open source software, that some corporations are actually exploiting the volunteer work of people doing it, and we have things like modern day slavery acts which prevent companies from taking advantage of other people, and to save open source, do we need to start getting corporations to realise that they are exploiting a community of volunteers predominantly without giving back to it, and really that's where the problem comes. It's the exploitation of the few by these big organisations.
Yeah, so I think I've heard pretty much everything. So it's around how can we prevent company from taking advantage of open source without giving back? Is that essentially it? Right. So, I mean, unfortunately, it's also back to the license model. It's not, that the design of open source is it's open. You can do whatever you want with it. Now, from a moral perspective, it's obviously bad to just rip open source, build products, and make tons of money out of that without giving back. But I think at least the vast majority of big corporations, they don't do that anymore. Like if you look at some of the open source projects, a lot of the contributors are actually the big companies. So I don't see like a systematic way where we could really prevent this other than education. And I think at some point, if people are already contributors, individually contributors to some project or in open source in general, usually they won't stay, at companies where the policy is, okay, let's just rip this off and we won't contribute anymore. So I think it's more like a bottom-up approach where individual engineers, they won't stay at those sort of companies, and as a result, I mean, if all the competent people are leaving, then the company doesn't have a product anymore. So hopefully, and maybe because I'm optimistic, I really hope that it's kind of self-solving itself over time.
I think Matt wanted to add something.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I don't think we can make generalizations like that anymore because, I mean, for those of us who've been around for a long time, you know, it certainly was the case 25 years ago that most open source software was developed by volunteers. But, I mean, for most of the large-scale projects now, that's not the case. 99.9% of people are employed by companies full-time to work on those projects. Where that hasn't been the case, it was already addressed somewhat, the problem of the other foundational pieces of software, like OpenSSL and things like that, but I've forgotten the name of the program within the Linux Foundation now, but there's a whole program to provide financial support to those projects that had kind of were foundational, but you know, were still being maintained by 2 volunteers. I mean, the people who I see being most loud about this problem, you know, is in communities like JavaScript, where people go, oh, I wrote this, you know, this JavaScript module that like 18 million people downloaded, and it, you know, is completely useless anyway, because all it does is change the color of the text in the terminal or something, you know, and you find those people, you know, throwing their tennies out the car going, why isn't anyone paying me? Well, you know, that's not actually, in that particular use case, it's not an important piece of software, and if people found it that important, somebody would be paying you to do it. You know, I mean, it's a bit of a controversial take, but I think there is a lot of, but I suppose my general point about that is that I don't think we can generalize about that thing anymore, about funding models.
I do think it's interesting. This is where I think applying some tech might be useful for awareness. You mentioned transparency and awareness as well, and I think, I'm not sure if anyone has seen the like, no SSO, or there's some website that sort of tries to publicize that for security reasons, the idea of putting single sign-on behind a paywall for your company, for your product, is like not the nicest behavior to have, because that's a security concern. You're using that against people to try and get them to give you money, and you know, I don't know. That's an opinion that people take, and they make it visible when there are products that do that say you have to be enterprise to be able to use this security feature. And I think there's a world where we make public and visible where there are companies that do and don't have open source policies. I've worked at companies where it's been really unclear if I'm allowed to commit to an open source project. And I've worked at companies where it's been really clear that I am. And I think those are the types of visibilities that are important. Because what I worry about with this bottom-up approach is the same thing with diversity in tech. What ends up happening is if we have like a 30% women in tech ratio, that's not 30% across all companies. That is a whole bunch of companies at 40, 50%, and a whole bunch of companies at 1 and 2. And it's like people but there are those people that are in those companies at 1 and 2% of diversity, and that's across gender, that's across race, that's across background of all sorts, that are living in a world that they may not feel like they can get out of. And so we want to support them as much as we support the people who are able to find and secure jobs in these very like luxurious in some ways companies that are following these best practices. So, yeah.
Just a wee comment on that, and Abby sort of approached it, which is you can address this with the regulation. If there's a reason to, you can. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not even a good not a lawyer, but I think you can. Like, you know, it's not just technology we have to look at. We can lobby for it.
Observation is, I think governance is vital for any CNCF project, any open source project, right? And I don't think we have a very good governance model. For example, if you're a community manager, most of the time you're focused on your end users, not focused on growing that developer community. So if you have one company behind one open source project, that product that company has doesn't address the market, there's no other alternative where you can continue to ensure that you fund, right? So it's this whole idea that one company behind something you're at a risk. Right? So that's sort of my observation.
I think a counter-argument to that is that quite often looking at end users will come and contribute to projects, and they then have an even stronger interest in supporting that project.
Yeah, I'm saying we should really focus. I do agree with you. What I'm saying is that we need to try and get these end users to become contributors, to become developers, so that you broaden out that ecosystem. That's what I'm doing.
Folks on the stage, we have we've got one more.
So I've been having a lot of conversations over the course of my time here about the necessity to strengthen communications across sectors between academic, public, industry, and I'm somebody who's jumped between those myself. So I wanted to ask you all here, like, what do you see as being the greatest opportunities to bring together, especially between the academic, government, and private or corporate sector? Because I've been hearing a lot about, like, what about investment and corporate, but what's the possibility for education and some of the larger institutions that could help to subsidize some of this work?
So which questions we do first? I mean, I'm going to address the first one around, being a user and then going to it. I think the personas are really different. We just need to figure out a way to have incentive for everyone. And, as a user, I don't necessarily want to contribute to the project, not all the time at least, because if everything I use, if I was to contribute to it, I wouldn't have any life, I guess. So there's not necessarily a direct path. I think we just need to figure out how to make everyone just happy. And I agree, like the community managers, if they are not able to address and make the project popular to attract developers, but just users, there's a gap here, right? So I think how to address it, that's another question. I'm not 100% sure. But again, to be honest, like I keep thinking about a reward system, a fair reward system. With, there's bounty rewards, all these kind of things that already exist for bugs and stuff like this. It's more than technology. It's also, of course, there is a technology behind it, but it's more like what behavior it does generate. Usually it's, as human, we need a technology to facilitate our lives. Here it's more like, because the technology is this way, it guarantees that it's going to be affecting, how we behave in relation to that particular project. For the other question, which is, quickly, how to, what are the opportunities to bring every verticals together, education, government? I think that's the purpose of open source in general. Like there's diversity of vertical, diversity of people. So all the open source events I've been attending, whether it's KCD or Open Source Summit, local, global, I think now we're at a point where every vertical, government, education, industries, they are all represented probably in a, maybe not proportionally, but everyone is there already. So there's already all those conversations.
I would say this event has been an incredibly good example of somewhere where, for example, having the government consultations happening, and there are industry people here, there are certainly academic people here, there is a pretty good, and I think exactly like you say, open source enables that kind of conversation. I'm very conscious that we're right at time, so Nic, then Abby, do you want to have your last words?
Better make them some good ones. This conference for me is fantastic because it's very much keeping the spirit of open source alive. And the spirit of open source for me is a lot of the grown-up conversations we've had around making sure we've got the right licenses in place, all the governance considerations, all that kind of stuff. But it's also about it's about that DIY ethic. It's about counterculture a little bit. The fantastic talk that we saw from Zen, for example, which was insane but also awesome. That balance, I think, is wonderful, and that kind of speaks to your the folks, the people that are here. We have this spirit, we have these people here, and the state of OpenCon has been a great way to bring these different conversations and these different strands together. So once again, I'm finishing on a ramble, so I will leave it there.
I have the last word. I'm not sure I have anything I'll let specialists say, but I think that you started with how do we get people with doing documentation. We've done a great job with that, and you ended by talking about how it's so great because we can bring all these verticals together. And I think that's the root of it. That's the spirit of it. And I think that if we do talk about using basically a reverse Conway maneuver of set some tech up so that people start to contribute more, if we start to do that, I think we can put in incentives to do things like reach out to universities and provide a course to it, or a session for a course about open source contributions and things like that.
Very early.
Yeah.
Earlier than what we do now.
Earlier, yeah, exactly, earlier. So I just think, the thing that I most donate my personal time to when it comes to open source has nothing to do with writing code. It's the working group that's trying to help write white papers and things like that and bring communities together, bring multiple vendors, multiple verticals, all those things. And that is what I'm passionate about. And I think that there's a lot of space for that to be impactful, so.
With that, please can you give everyone here and all of yourselves a big round of applause for being here and for asking wonderful questions and participating in what I think has been an amazing event.